We want to talk about land, in particular, the 168 million acres that we call Texas. And what I want to focus on is the fate, the division, the structure of the 142 million acres that are private farms, ranches, and forest lands. Now, if we were giving this presentation 5 years ago, we would have talked about the 144 million acres of private farms, ranches, and forest lands in Texas. So what I want to do is go over some of the recent trends in land use, talk about some of the relationships that we see there, what those relationships can teach us, and then lay out some lessons learned that might help us make some progress into the next decade and even into the next 25 years in being able to conserve private farms, ranches, and forest lands, but with a purpose being the provision of those public benefits that we derive off of those lands, in addition to the obvious commodities that they produce and the security that they provide for our state and nation. And then I want to talk about some of those challenges and how we might be able to overcome some challenges. So here we are, state of Texas, looks like a paintball target. This is actually the nighttime illumination values if you were to be in a satellite over the state. And you can see the obvious splotches where you'd expect the splotches if you know the state. If we looked at our state over the last 10 years for which we have the most accurate data, so I'm going to go over a 10-year period in most of the things that I talk about with you here, this 10-year period. In order for us to get a gauge on trends, will be 1997 to 2007. Now, what I can tell you is that from 2007 to 2010, there are some differences. I'll point those out where we know about them. But then for most everything else, the trends have basically remained steady over the last 3 to 4 years. So we had 22% population growth in the state, so we increased by 4.3 million people. We will likely increase by another 5 to 6.5 million people by 2020. So over the next, best way to think about it is over the next 10 years, we're going to increase by at least 5 million. So what's the consequences of that, and what can some of the information that we've looked at on the land trend study tell us about the consequences for rural lands across the state of Texas? Well, there is a consequence. You just simply can't add more people and expect nothing to happen, obviously. Over that 10-year period of record, we had a net loss of 1.5 million acres of farms, ranches, and forest lands. Now, it's pretty much a permanent loss, so a one-way ticket, if you will, into being a Home Depot or a Walmart parking lot or a subdivision. 40% of that conversion were in our top 25 growth counties within the state. That top 25 of growth counties absorbed about 85% of our population expansion. So 10% of our land area, in essence, absorbed 85% of the population growth between 1997 and 2007, and the consequence was about 40% of the loss of rural farms, ranches, and forest lands. By the way, the area that we lost was an area the size of Bexar County, plus Travis County, plus Rockwall County, which is a little bitty county up in North Texas. And so it was a fairly substantial area. So that 85% of the population growth that we absorbed in those 25 high-growth counties, 40% of our rural land loss. So just in those 25 counties, we lost an area about the size of Harris County. So about the size of metropolitan Houston was gone over that 10-year period, just in these 25 counties. So there's a data point. If, in fact, these land consumption rates continue, we will lose another 270 acres per 1,000 new residents over the next 10 years, if in fact the patterns of development and the patterns of land consumption over the next 10 years are the same as they were in the 10-year period that we looked at here. So, on the average, across the state, in those high-growth counties, we lose about 270 acres per thousand new individuals coming in. And that's a handy way to begin to look at what some of the potentials are, because we have very good demographic estimates of where our population expansion is going to be. But we also have real spatially explicit estimates of what this land consumption rate is. So let's look, for example, at our two most crowded metropolitan areas, so the Houston metropolitan area and the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area. We end up having about 100, they're very similar in their land consumption rates, somewhere between 180 and 190 acres lost to development for every 1,000 new residents. Let's look at another area. So let's look at Travis County and Bexar County. Combined, because they're about the same in their patterns, we lose 280 acres per 1,000 new residents. Now let's look at something that's interesting, which is the I-35 corridor growth area, and you take those 5 counties that are high-growth counties that are adjacent to Bexar County and Travis County, and let's exempt Bexar County and Travis County from the calculation, and just look at those high-growth counties that are adjacent to Bexar County and Travis County, and we lose 559 acres per 1,000 new residents in those high-growth expansion counties. So, message there, where we grow is critically important in projecting what our land consumption rates will be going into the next couple of decades, and whether we use land in the same way as we add a new unit of people, if you think of a unit of people as being 1,000. So here's again our nighttime illumination model that shows some of those growth areas that we had over that period. Here's another area in the state where we get a really high expansion up in northeast Texas, and in the Tyler Longview area we end up with about 545 acres lost per 1,000 new residents. So with current rates of land consumption, the high growth areas, if in fact we grow the way our state demographer projects we will grow in those high growth areas, and if in fact our land consumption rates stay the same, so there's two assumptions there, if in fact our land consumption rates stay steady in those areas, then we will lose likely another 1.4 million acres of farms, ranches, and forest lands between now and 2020. So what this means, though, when we look at the variability in those land consumption rates, is that it matters critically what we do as far as policy decisions are concerned, so that, for example, if we do some things that pushes development out of major metropolitan areas, let's say out of Houston into the high growth areas outside of Houston, or out of San Antonio, Bexar County, and those high growth counties around there, we could likely lose 3 million acres instead of 1.4 million acres. Or conversely, there may be some things that we can do, for example, in creating more profitable landscapes near these high growth areas by paying landowners for those ecosystem services and those public benefits that those lands provide that make those lands less susceptible to development, and we might actually end up with less of a loss as we look into the future. Now, quite likely we're still going to continue to have some loss of rural farms, ranches, and forest lands, but our idea here is not to do away with people. Our idea here is to figure out how we can sustain our agricultural productivity and our state's economic infrastructure. So, this is my people are like grizzly bears slide. So the way to think about this is here's the ownership size distribution across the state of Texas. Now, if you look up in the upper left-hand corner, those are the proportions of the landscape that are made up by those ownerships that are less than 100 acres in size. So those farms, ranches, and forest lands where the ownership is less than 100 acres in size. Those that are bright green, that means there's a lot of them. When it's maroon or red, that means there's not very much of them. So we can see that it pretty much follows our rainfall pattern. So our principal and primary distribution of ownership sizes was established basically when Texas was still in an agrarian land use phase. In other words, we settled our land in a way that made sense from a net primary productivity perspective. Like a grizzly bear, if there's not very much productivity out there, we take a lot of space. Okay, so in the Trans-Pecos, in order to sustain an operation, tens of thousands of acres. In Deep East Texas, in order to sustain an operation, maybe 100 acres, right? So, like a grizzly bear, our range contracts and expands given the net primary productivity of what's adjacent to us. Now, one of the things that's been interesting and predictable over time in the state of Texas is that we went through the same phases that all other very highly developed areas go through. We went through the transportation phase, so we came out of our agrarian phase, went into this industrial phase where we relaxed those net primary productivity constraints. Now I'm dipping off into, I'm a wildlife biologist, so I turn everything into that, but we dipped away from that and began to think and began to settle lands dependent upon the transportation infrastructure, so we relaxed those constraints. And then more recently, in fact, over the last 15 to 20 years, we've come into more of an information phase, if you will, so that the means for gaining resources, the means of wealth, were not necessarily dependent upon local net primary productivity, nor were they really dependent upon regional net primary productivity. It was really completely relaxed the constraints that resulted in what we have as our primary feature across the state of Texas as far as ownership size is concerned. This is an artifact. This is an artifact of our agrarian phase. So if you look over there at those ownerships that are greater than 2,000 acres in size, East Texas, not very much of them. West Texas, Trans-Pecos, a lot of them. So that our net primary productivity bent in that agrarian phase explains why this pattern is there. But what has happened over the last decade or two really can't be explained by net primary productivity and our relationship to the land from a strict productive perspective. But nevertheless, there's still a relationship out there, and a relationship that critically matters that has to do with size, and that's ownership size. And we talk a lot about fragmentation, why fragmentation's bad and this type of stuff. We need to put some real meat behind that. Why we need to pay attention to ownership size. Does size really matter? And if size matters, then we have some reason and rationale to put some meat behind a program that can maintain size of ownerships. And if we maintain size of ownerships, then we can also maintain profitability, and if we maintain profitability, then we can perhaps stave off some of the loss of rural farms and ranches. So let's look at a productivity curve, and this is ownership size along the bottom axis, and then along the vertical axis, looking at the proportion of ownerships in that size category that were profitable. Okay, now this is during a single year, but it's a pretty good idea because it's across 142 million acres of the state. So those ownerships that were greater than 2,000 acres in size, for example, had about 62 to 63% or a 0.62 probability of being profitable if your ownership was that size. If you were really small, not so much, right? Not so much. All right, another reason or thing about size, and size matters. We vary in the amount in the blue line there. You've got the number of full-time farmers and ranchers, those people that full-time are stewards of that land, and full-time have the interests of their lives completely 100% aligned with the profitable interests of that land, so that they're paying attention. They're paying attention to the dollars and cents. 75% of those ownerships that are greater than 2,000 acres in size, on the average across the state, 75% of those landowners are full-time farmers or ranchers. Smaller sizes, not so much. In fact, you get below about 260 acres, and it's less than 40%. Now, what surprises me is we've actually got some people that have really, really small places that claim to be full-time. So, you know, something like 26 or 27% of ownership sizes that are less than 40 acres in size claim to be full-time farmers and ranchers. I'm not sure what they're growing, but and also, if you look on that red line, the incidence of residing on those properties and those smaller properties is actually higher. So size matters for this reason. Now, size matters also for, you know, magnitude of profitability. So if we look at ownership size across the state on a amount of net profit per acre, really small ownerships losing on the average up to $150 to $200 per acre. That's hard to make up, and that's hard to justify unless, good thing, you're operating a small acreage ownership, right? If you're losing that much per acre. Only when you get up above 140 acres do we even have a on the average greater than zero net profit for ownerships across the state. And then it gets up on the average grade. Now keep in mind, we're talking about everything from cows to cotton in this calculation here. Okay, let's look at some shifts over that 10-year period in ownership size distribution. And I'm going to depend upon your knowledge of the ecological regions of the state of Texas, and I'll point some of those out here in just a second for those of you that might not be completely familiar with them. But we've got two patterns, basically, and I'm only going to refer to 4 ecological regions here because they represent those two patterns that we have, and then we'll look at some other data here in a minute that will bring the whole state into clearer view. If we look in the high plains, what we have on the far right axis there is an indication that we had consolidation over that 10-year period. In other words, we gained somewhere in the neighborhood of 750,000 acres of ownerships that were greater than 2,000 acres in size. What that means in blue-collar language is we ended up consolidating smaller ownerships into larger ownerships. About 750,000 acres, 750,000 acres in the high plains got aggregated into bigger ownerships over that 10-year period. Something happened that created that pattern in the high plains. Can't really explain all of it, but there's something that explains it because it was a pattern. Likewise in the Blackland Prairie. Now, both of these areas are dominated by croplands, those of you that know the state. Now, let's look at South Texas and the Edwards Plateau and bring your attention to those ownership sizes that are greater than 2,000 acres in size again. So the far right bar, a loss in South Texas of about 250,000 acres of large ranches. In the Edwards Plateau, 1.2 million acres of large ranches that was lost to fragmentation during that 10-year period from 97 to 2007. Now, there's some indications that not only has this fragmentation trend continued, but there's a couple of data points that might suggest it's actually accelerated. And I'll show you those in just a minute. So anyway, if we look on the left-hand side here, we can see what that fragmentation pattern is across the state. If we map those areas of the state where large ownerships broke up versus those areas of the state where large ownerships were accumulated, we can see that there's a pattern in the high plains and then a pattern throughout West Texas, the Edwards Plateau, and South Texas, some over in East Texas, and then over there in the Blackland Prairies, central part of the state. For those of you that don't know, is the Blackland Prairies, and so we've got some consolidation in there. And we've got those areas labeled on the far right map. So everything is red. Those ecological regions that are in red are largely fragmented over that 10-year period. Those that are in green largely consolidated. And in fact, if we look at Texas and the ownership size distribution changes over that 10-year period and just averaged it all together, you'd look down there and go, well, gosh, we didn't lose hardly any large ownerships because it pretty much averaged out. But there's some areas of the state where we continue, apparently, to even go down to smaller ownership sizes. So I've borrowed some data here. I borrowed it, of course, all of this is borrowed data, but I borrowed more data from the real estate center at Texas A&M and drug out the median ownership size, the median tract size of real estate sales, and just pulled it out for the 1980, 1990, 2000, and 2010. And just looking at it for the Hill Country in South Texas, because that was one of our fragmenting areas, if you will, from that 10-year period. So now we're looking at it over a longer period. We're looking at it over 4 decades. And look at the Hill Country. So we went from average tract size that was sold in the Hill Country in 1980 of about 145 acres. That was the average, not average, the median tract size. Now the median tract size is 58 acres. 58 acres in 2010. Likewise, in South Texas, we went from pretty stable and, in fact, arguably increasing tract size between 1980 and 2000, and then that tract size was cut in half by 2010. Now, 2010 was a weird real estate year for those of you that know real estate in Texas, because we were coming out of, or hopefully coming out of, our economic slump. So it may be that smaller ownerships were selling while larger ownerships were just languishing on the market. So that's one explanation, but there's all kinds of explanations and speculations, but data don't lie, right? So here's some other things to look at, though, when we look at the comparison across the other 2 regions that were consolidating regions. So this is a completely independent data set. We look at the panhandle of Texas, where the High Plains is, and we really had stable tract sizes as far as median sales. A little bit of a dip in 2010, likewise in the Rolling Plains, so that West Texas that wasn't the Trans-Pecos. Now, just for fun, let's look at the Trans-Pecos. Let's look at the Trans-Pecos, and I didn't put the Trans-Pecos on these because because the acreage sizes are so small, it just dwarfs everything else. Trans-Pecos, ownership size. Median ownership size, median tract size sold, I'm sorry, not ownership size. Median tract sizes sold during those 4 10-year periods went from over 10,000 acres as the median tract size, so the ranch size that was sold in the Trans-Pecos, went down to 6,000 acres, kind of stabilized in there, about 7,000 acres. 2010, less than 2,000 acres in size. Now, there's where that explanation may come in as far as the market simply not being able to absorb large ranches as far as purchases are concerned. But nevertheless, this is an independent data set that points to some of the same things that we were seeing in our land fragmentation data as far as these tract sizes for lands that are sold. Now, this is kind of out on the periphery, lands being bought and sold. To be sure, we still have plenty of large ownerships in the state. It's all is not lost. We still have plenty of large ownerships in the Trans-Pecos, in the Edwards Plateau, in South Texas. But there's some things that we could perhaps do and take some cues from what happened in other areas where either the policies or the economics as far as profitable land management were concerned that actually stimulated land consolidation as opposed to land fragmentation. So here's just to sum this up. We consolidated a little over 2 million acres during that 10-year period from 97 to 2007, and then we fragmented about 3 million acres during that same period. But it was in different parts of the state, so there are different situations. So there's some things we can probably learn from that. Let's look at land values. In 2007, and you can these are land values that come from the central appraisal districts. So there's flaws in there because the central appraisal districts at times will underappraise lands, but there's still a pattern, right? It's pretty easy to look up here and see, by George, the land values in Houston, San Antonio, Austin, and Dallas-Fort Worth, and then in the areas around there are higher, and that's what you'd expect. And so no real problems there if you look at this as an index and consider that on the average these are appraised at least equivalent, all things equal. Okay, changes from 1997 to 2007, and just what some of the changes held in store for us. Let's look at what those changes were divided up into our ecological regions. The high plains, there was only about a 35 to 40% increase in appraised values during that period. But in the Edwards Plateau, we had almost a 250% increase in appraised values in the Edwards Plateau. Okay, let's just take these two ends of the spectrum and then consider that anything in between is going to be a gradient. Let's look at from 1966 to 2010, just one of those hot areas in the Edwards Plateau, so Barnett, Llano, Gillespie, and Mason counties. And in that area, we can see that sure enough, we had a huge spike that started in about 1994. Still, perhaps, is not done with. And again, this is from the real estate centers, and these are size adjusted price per acre. So almost $6,000 per acre, up from about $1,000 per acre in 1994. But then let's look up here in the High Plains in just this Square County area, where all the counties are exactly the same size and same shape, and really not so much of an identifiable trend upward that entire time. And in fact, for what the economists call the real values actually decrease. So when you adjust it for inflation, the value of land in the High Plains actually decreased when adjusted for inflation over that time period. Now I'll go back and look at, if we look at our Edwards Plateau example, that red line, which is that one that's adjusted for inflation, increased, in fact, increased quite a lot. So it's likely the amenity values in the Edwards Plateau, those things that we all know make that area important for a lot of people, but rural farmers and ranchers can't capture. So there's an importance value out there that we all know is there. It's somehow providing public benefit. It's water recharge. It's sometimes aesthetic values, just open space. Other times it's the biodiversity and other ecosystem services and recreational services that those properties provide that aren't related to the net primary productivity of that ground that has resulted in that spike in prices. So here's our challenge. I've got about 7 minutes left here. We've got to figure out how to minimize per capita land consumption. That's just, someone's got to say that out loud. We're going to get more people, okay? We got to figure out how not to lose 500 acres every time we get 1,000 people. We just got to figure that part out. We got to do it in a way where we're working on the landowner's side so that we're efficiently creating policy solutions that safeguard that land from high levels of consumption. So by creating something that competes with that demand for sprawl, if you will. We've got to figure out how to reverse the fragmentation trends. These may be different tools that do these two things right here. So reversing the fragmentation trends, and we've got to figure out how to stabilize land ownership in the state. So our real challenge is just exactly what we have here. And if we're to maintain the capacity to produce all the renewable resources needed to sustain a prosperous economy in Texas and our contribution to the nation's economy. In fact, we're the 12th largest economy on the globe if you look at it from a GDP perspective. We got to figure out how to do a few things better than we've done them in the past. And so we need some new incentives. Here's 4 or 5 things, perhaps not worded in the way an economist would word them, but worded in the way that a wildlife biologist might word them, that we need to do. We got to develop some standard measures Now, these build on each other. We've got to develop some standard measures that reflect the resource outputs from private lands. And these must be accurate and reliable. We've got to be able to depend upon those measures so that we know when we say something's produced, it's accurate, it's reliable, it's the same every time. We've got to refine our management and conservation investment model so that we get a higher return on investment. And in fact, so that we actually look at return on investment for our limited conservation dollars so that we can prioritize. So when there are public monies available, we can assure the public that the best return on investment is being sought, that it's not just an ad hoc process in investing those conservation dollars. We need to establish secure ownership rights over the resources that we value from private lands. This is controversial, but there's only two alternatives the way I see it. We can either lose those values or we can create a whole new set of command and control regulations. But we already know from experience, and we don't have to try it again, that harsh command and control regulations basically result in the same thing that in the acceleration of the same thing that we've seen over the past decade: higher fragmentation rates, landowners selling, and division of properties and depending upon other resources. We've got to create markets and market-based systems, new institutions that are supported by profitable land management. And that profitable land management needs to come from those very values that we can't measure right now, or we don't have good measures for, but are valuable to the public. And we need to create policies that then stimulate investments in private lands conservation. And they have to be investments that go beyond the excellent programs we have in philanthropy and the government programs that use taxpayer money to pay into conservation programs. We've got to make conservation pay from a business perspective, which is the only way to make it sustainable. That's my story.
Well, Dr. Wilkins, based upon the trends that you were showing there with regards to ownership size, and particularly with regards to agriculture, with profitability, and just in general your presentation, how important, in your opinion, is it that we have ag valuation for property taxes in the state of Texas for agricultural lands?
Well, that's an excellent question. So ad valorem taxation for agricultural use it basically means that we're taxing landowners on a use value instead of a conceptual value if they were to monetize their lands. And the bottom line is it would be absolutely catastrophic for the state of Texas if we were to lose, from just an objective perspective, if we were to lose ad valorem taxation for agricultural use. The reason is that if you do the calculations on what that rate would be for those landowners, there is no possible way that we could have a majority of our landowners, particularly in those areas that are suffering high fragmentation rates as they are now, that would not be forced into subdividing that ownership and selling. And then you've got to think, okay, what then? If they subdivide and sell, who's going to buy once they realize the story, if you will, that now ad valorem taxation is not going to be allowed for agricultural use? We would likely see decreasing property values, right? Because that's factored in. So to me, I can't imagine anything that would hurt one. If you wanted to destroy the rural infrastructure of the state of Texas in one fell swoop, that's what you do, you know.
You touched on it, and it's about the regulatory, not just regulatory atmosphere, but regulations and their impact on land use,
right,
land values and such. And it's, we're sort of touching on it, but, I hope that at some point I'd like to see, a little bit more background, a little bit more information.
I'm going to get more specific?
Yes.
Okay. What the fear would be? Let's take.
Okay, well, okay, fears, yes, because I know that's certainly, you know, a part of it. But what is happening? How is regulation, what are the regulations that are impacting land values and land uses and land changes, these
Okay.
trends that you're discussing? Thanks, Neal.
All right, now let me just compare two things, and then and I don't know if that if it'll answer your question or not, but it's two ways of doing business, right? And let's take water, for example. Let's take water quality and water quantity. Right now, we could try to figure out how to get those metrics out there for private land so that we could figure out how to incentivize private landowners to produce water. In the tail end of this drought, we've got to figure that out, okay? We're a state that uses 14 billion gallons of water a day. If you were to put that in a swimming pool, that swimming pool would have to be 50 foot by 50 foot, and it would be 35 miles deep. That's how much fresh water we use in a single day. By 2060, we're going to use 4 billion gallons per day more. So we've got to figure out how to incentivize private landowners to do that. Now, we could punish them into doing that. So, for example, we could expand the authority that the EPA has through the Clean Water Act so that the navigable waters of the United States would include essentially all waters, so that we could have EPA having regulatory authority over the waters, all waters. Thereby, we could then centrally command and control what people are using. Hoping to come up with some kind of result there. Now, if we look at those two scenarios, knowing what we know about incentives, people's response to incentives, and landowners' behaviors, perhaps rightfully so, which one of those is doomed for failure and which one of those might be destined for success?